Good morning, class. My name is Richard Anthony, and today I'm going to be presenting to you my research project, Race and Marriage Outcomes, a Quantitative Analysis. To begin, I want to propose a question, which asks, in what ways does race influence marriage outcomes? When we think of race here in the United States, we often think of a few things, such as a person's skin tone, white, black, brown, or a different language, perhaps Spanish, English, Portuguese. These different kinds of languages are how we define a person's race. When we think of marriage outcomes, we think of perhaps marrying within our own race or marrying outside of our race, marriage outcomes. These two concepts are found throughout my study and throughout my literature review, which was why it's important to consider them. So, studies have proven that contact theory predicts how one is going to connect with other races outside of their own. So, in 1954, Alport coined contact hypothesis or contact theory, which states under appropriate social conditions, contact reduces prejudice amongst interracial groups. So, what this means in a different kind of sense is that when one race, which is the majority race, sees a minority race coming into places that they are hanging out, in their school or in their church, contact theory is known to reduce those biases that they have of those different races coming into their group, which means that we have to be in frequent contact with people outside of our race in order for us to perhaps reduce a certain bias. And my literature review also found some Pew Research Center facts that was reported in the New York Times, which in 2015, 37% of Americans agreed marrying different races was a good thing for society, and 9% of Americans reported marrying different races was a bad thing for society. So, what does this mean for 2019? Does it change with different laws, with different presidents in office? And so, I wanted to figure that out. To continue on with my literature review, there were studies that found and supported Alport's contact hypothesis or contact theory. And in 2013, Perry found that the greater presence of people of color in neighborhoods and congregations of whites predicted favorable attitudes towards interracial marriage, which is very important to consider because in places like California, where there's known to be more a mix of different races, perhaps prejudice and biases are not as strong in the western part of the United States as they are in the southern part of the United States. And so Perry found evidence to support that when more people of color are in neighborhoods and churches that are whites occupied, perhaps it is known to reduce prejudice amongst those different groups perceived by whites. And also in my literature review found in 2015 by Perry and Whitehead, which states that levels of intolerance directed towards outgroups vary by how the in-groups perceive particular outgroups relative to others. So what does this mean? Well, it means that perception is a very important thing we keep in mind when we view other races outside of our own. So when the perception of a different race is known to cause biases, well, Perry and Whitehead found that out. And also in their studies, which was supported through the perception of Christian nationalism, which states that strongly fused values of religious and political spheres favoring Christian influence in the federal government. So, what does this mean for perception? Well, it means that when whites perceive different races outside of their own intermingling and being accepted into congregations and neighborhoods, it means that they will be likely more known to support other races or marrying outside of their own. But if Christian nationalists don't perceive other people inside of their church or inside of their neighborhoods, perhaps more stronger biases are going to be upheld because the perception of a different race is not seen in their world or their reality. And so I set out to figure this question out. After reading my literature review, I asked myself one question: in what ways does race influence marriage outcomes? And so to conduct my study, I created an online anonymous survey utilizing Qualtrics. Also, social network platforms such as Gmail, Reddit, Facebook, and word of mouth were used to collect data. Some of the survey measurements that I used were separating race into different categories found most common throughout the United States. Likert scales and subjective experience questions were used to measure the different attitudes, and the different subjective experiences that the participants were feeling or upheld. And in my sample, my sample included students and non-students 18 years or older with access to the internet. So, my research design, levels of measurement. Race was coded as nominal, obviously, because race cannot be an order. Coded as 0, which was the category given for whites or European descent. 1 was coded as person of color, and 97 was international or some other race, since they were not being able to identify with a study conducted in the US. My dependent variable, marriage outcomes, was a scale level of measurement, and the codes for that were ranging from very uncomfortable, a -2, to very comfortable, with a 0 being neither. And then my control variable for number 1 was interracial contact, which was a scale level of measurement, and those were coded as 0 to never, to 4 always. My second control variable was Christian nationalism, which is a scale level of measurement, and that was coded as strongly disagree to strongly agree, the 0 being neither. So, in what ways does race influence marriage outcomes? Well, as the inferential statistics reported, there was a higher mean associated with whites or European descent, the 0 category, the 0 coded value, than there was for person of color, which was my number 1 value coded. So, as we can see, 88 participants responded to my question that were of white or European descent, and 100 participants responded to my question about the same question, about marriage outcomes. So that makes 188 total people that took and responded to this question. And so as we can see, that the significant value found between my independent and dependent variable was 0.191, which means that according to our discipline, there was no significant value found between the independent and dependent variable. So, to continue, my null hypothesis was accepted. There is no relationship between race and preference for interracial marriage. And so, one important thing to consider when analyzing my hypothesis is that although my research hypothesis was rejected, I thought it was quite interesting to note that the research hypothesis was quite the opposite of what I originally stated. So, in my research hypothesis, I stated that preference for interracial marriage will be greater for people of color than white people, which was rejected. But as you can see in the mean value of this question, that the mean is higher for whites or European descent, which means, according to the numbers, that whites and European descent are more comfortable with their daughter marrying outside of their race than people of color or person of color, which was a lower mean value, which was at 1.1680. So, although my research hypothesis was rejected, I still think it's a key thing to note that it's quite the opposite according to the data and the numbers. So, to continue on with my data analysis, when I ran multivariate statistics, what I found was that the average value of the marriage outcome question for all respondents was 1.060, which means that for the majority most people that took my survey are comfortable with their daughter marrying outside of their race. However, one important thing to consider when discussing this research topic is Christian nationalism. In previous studies conducted by Carey and Whitehead, they found that Christian nationalism was a strong predictor variable to somebody asking a question of their daughter marrying outside of their race. And so, as you can see, Christian nationalism was the only significant predictor variable between all the other independent variables measured up against my dependent variable, which had a significant value of 0.002. So what that means for my research study in particular is that my evidence was supported from other research. Although my research hypothesis was rejected, my control variable 2, measured as an independent variable against my dependent variable, shows that these results will be significant across the board. So to continue on with the conclusion and the limitations of my study, I want to bring up that the geographical location of my survey matters. Will participants choose and respond differently to questions when asked in California versus Kentucky? Will they choose differently when asked in states like Indiana or Ohio? These things are important to consider because in states that are in the South, maybe there's not a lot of minorities or people of color in those states as there are in states like California or New York. And so geographical location is one limitation to my study. And one important thing to consider in my study, and perhaps why my research hypothesis was rejected, was from a concept known as social desirability bias. And so what that means is that some people who take surveys are known to either over-report or under-report acceptable behavior. And so although this may or may not be the case in my own research design and research study statistics, I just want to kind of bring that up to bring people aware to, hey, this may or may be a reason why my research hypothesis was not supported. And also another thing to consider is what would happen to the numbers if we ran ANOVA statistics. In my research design, I was only able to, as a class, we were only able to compare 2 different groups. But perhaps if we were to compare 3 or more groups between the races and measure the independent variable being different other than race, perhaps the results would come back with more significant range values. So I am proposing for future studies that instead of the independent variable being race, perhaps age or Christian nationalism when running ANOVA statistics would produce significant values across the board. But other than that, I want to thank everyone for allowing me the space and time to present my research project, and I hope that you got something out of it and you learned something. Again, my name is Richard Anthony, and this was Race and Marriage Outcomes, a Quantitative Analysis. Thank you.